Hi, I'm Owen from Rask Australia. Thanks for tuning in to the Rask Network. Before we get into today's show, there are a few things we have to go over. Firstly, what you're about to hear and see is limited to general information only. It's not personal financial advice like you get from a financial planner. Also, it's important to remember that past performance is not indicative of future performance. That means that anything that's happened in the past, or we say today, is not necessarily going to reflect what happens in the future. Lastly, please consider that any of the guests or myself are featuring on this program may have a financial interest in some of the products or shares mentioned. That's enough from me. I hope you enjoyed today's program.
G'day, welcome to the Australian Property Podcast. This is our weekly 2 cents segment. I'm your host, Pete Wargent, and I'm joined by, as usual, Chris Bates. Welcome, Chris. How's your week been?
Pete, always good to chat, mate. Doing well. A bit sick actually, so I hope I don't sound too croaky on today. A cold, flu's turned into some type of chest infection, so not having much fun. Spent last week down in Melbourne at a conference and seeing lots of our partners and financial advisors, etc. So it was a good week, but sickness. Once I'm on top of this, I'll be feeling a bit better. But how's life in the UK, Pete?
I thought you'd been uncharacteristically quiet. You've been very quiet on the chat this past week or two. So a conference and an illness would probably account for that. It's all good over here. Just like all middle-aged expats, catching up with my parents. I guess it's one of those things you don't think about much as a backpacker, but as middle-age encroaches, you realise parents aren't going to be around forever. So just been doing a bit of that this week, and it's all been good.
Absolutely. Lots going on in the market. Obviously, the RBA increased yesterday, which is, a bit of a surprise, really. If you look at it, was a surprise last month, but I think as we got closer to the decision, it became less of a surprise. We'll have a really good chat about that next week once we've got the minutes through, and we can really get a bit of a more of a better read on it, really. But what are we covering today, Pete? What's our 3 big stories?
Right. So if you're not familiar, this is our weekly 2 cent segment. So we're on a mission to become Australia's most trusted property podcast. And every Sunday at 7 a.m, our 2 cents segment will be waiting for you in your podcast player. And these are a bit of fun where we just cover the big 3 news stories of the week, bit of a rapid fire conversation. And do send any questions as well, because we always like to try and cover what is topical and what's of interest. Big 3 news stories of the week. I think the Reserve Bank interest rate decision feeds through all of these in one way or another. So we might just do a deep dive on that next week once we've got the minutes, as you said. The big 3 news stories this week then. So firstly, the Fair Work Commission announced that award wages would increase by 5.75%, a bit more than people might have expected, and the minimum wage increasing 8.6%. So a bit more fuel onto the fire there. Second story, lending to buy or build a new home is now the lowest level since September 2008. And this was before the recent interest rate hikes. And with the lending buffer to stay in place and interest rates going up, well, what the heck happens next? That's our second story of the week. And then thirdly, on housing supply, Productivity New South Wales released a paper proposing how and where more homes might be built and the kind of supply that might be needed between now and 2041. So there's some interesting findings there. So there's loads to talk about as usual, Chris. So where should we kick off? Minimum wage?
Yeah, it's interesting. The second one, the 8.65, I think there's only very few people getting that. I think it's under 1%, right? I think it's the 5.6 odd or 5.7% or whatever it was. That was larger than what the market expected. And I think that's when we're looking at, the markets, I think markets are already pricing in a lot of things, right? And when there's a surprises, like inflation's more sticky or, we get this increase to wages bigger than people expected, that hasn't been factored in, right? And, that changes and that's what I think fed into the RBA decision yesterday is that, what is it, 20% of workers on that, Pete? What's the stats?
Yeah, so I think yes, you're right. The minimum wage increase 8.6%. It's actually less than 1% of Australian employees are paid the minimum wage, and a lot of them are part-timers at that. That's great for the people on the minimum wage, but it's not going to move the needle in terms of the economy. I think the bigger issue is the award wages. So a pay rise of 5.75%, that impacts around 2.6 million workers across the country. And yeah, a bit higher than expected. So that's, I guess, when you look at it, there's 13 million or so employees. It's just over 20% of Australian employees. So significant in that sense. But don't forget, though, and Michael Pascoe did a good piece in the New Daily on this. Don't forget that a lot of those workers earning the award wages, let's say they're on 50K a year, 5.75% increase, but after tax, it's only 4.3% increase, and inflation has been hammering along at higher levels than that, as we all know. So probably not going to increase its spending in the economy too much. It's just a little bit more fuel onto the fire at a time when people are very twitchy about inflationary pressures. So I think I don't think it was a direct impact necessarily on the monetary policy decision this week, but just another thing that's just adding to that inflationary pressure sticking around for longer.
Yeah, I do think, that a lot of people who are on the minimum wage, times are tough right now, like, fuel, food, mortgages, lots of things that are costing more money than they were. And, there wasn't probably much money left over anyway. And so a little bit of extra income is probably mean they're not going into as much debt, they're more, and they're probably already making cutbacks. And so I don't think they're going to go down and some consumer spending and retail spending is going to jump, etc. I think it's really just helping them cover the cost because inflation was actually higher than that. So the costs have gone up more than that. So, but yeah, it was a surprise. But I think it's also a good thing and needed for that part of the workers, right? So, but I just think obviously it does feed into this, last thing we want to be doing. And I think there's tax cuts that are potentially going to come in through next year. I think that's going to become a big talking point over the next 12 months, Pete. What's your take on the likelihood of that going through?
Yeah, I think that seems to be baked in already. I think that was something that was brought forward from an earlier government. I think, look, the minimum wage, as you sort of touched on at the beginning there, that's less than 1% of employees. Most minimum wage earners are renters rather than people with mortgages. But actually, the mortgage rate's going up. A lot of those rents, in a tight rental market, a lot of those costs are going to get passed on. So I don't think the spending issues, it's not going to take off from here. I just think we've already seen household spending in the economy slow. By the time this goes to air, we'll have seen some more figures from the national accounts. But the general trend is domestic demand is slowing because of all of those interest rate hikes that we've seen. So, I don't think we're going to see retail taking off again from these levels. I think we're sort of beyond the peak for that. Could it result in further tightening of interest rates? Well, I guess we'll only really know in the fullness of time because there's a whole lot of other data to come out between now and next month. And the next month, we've got things like monthly inflation that's being watched closely. There'll be figures on all sorts of stuff, retail sales, building approvals. But it doesn't feel like spending is going to take off from here. But it does feel like the environment is as though the Reserve Bank's going to keep hiking until the data unambiguously says they can stop. And so a bit more pain in the post by the looks of it.
And I think this leads into our second story, Pete, around construction, right? I mean, what's the news story here?
Yeah, so the latest lending indicators figures show that lending for new homes or the construction of a new home fell to the lowest level since September 2008. And don't forget, when you're looking at these figures, the Australian population is growing. Generally, prices have increased over the past 15 years. These are very bad numbers. Now, it is slightly skewed because we went through a period where we saw the home builder stimulus. And I think often a lot of the graphs and charts we've seen through the pandemic, they suddenly go really high and then they suddenly go really low. And you can probably draw a line through them sometimes and then average out somewhere in the middle. But I think, there's a lot of builders and developers going insolvent at the moment. New home sales are already at decade lows, and now we've had another interest rate hike. I think the interesting thing was the housing industry associations put out a press release this week, and they said, look, because of the very long lags in this cycle, we're only just now starting to see the impact of the first interest rate hike, let alone the 12th. So one would sort of read into that building approvals figures are going to be low for quite some time to come. Now, Chris, you deal with this stuff at the coalface all the time. Why aren't people buying new homes off the plan or buying stuff to build now? Is it borrowing capacity being an issue? or is it fear? What's the main driver?
It's interesting, Pete. When you say about the RBA increasing 12 times, that's what I keep reading, right? But it's actually, if you look at it, if you consider an increase is 0.25, it's actually 16 times. It's been 12 times they've increased, but they actually increased 2 times at some of the rate increases. And I think the media is saying it's 12 times, right? So you think 12 times 0.25, that's 3%. Well, it's actually gone up 4%. And I think that's something the media keeps saying. It keeps frustrating me. But I think with this demand for new construction, I generally think there's a massive, there was a credit card sort of spending event, home builder, right? We brought forward future demand to, the COVID times. And that's, people who are thinking about building a new home thought, well, now's the time to do it. I was thinking about doing it next year. I could get 5% deposit home loans, home builder. Why don't we do it now? So I think that was that for the building industry. But I think it's just that real sentiment, do I want to go into a lot of debt? These people are really, generally a lot of their greenfield estates are first home buyers. Money's tight. They've saved really hard up for their deposit. And, do they really want to take risk when there's all this negative sentiment, and they're worried about their jobs and their inflation and, they're worried about builders going bust. You can see the Australian Current Affair and, putting articles on Porter Davis and, so I think it's just a real sentiment issue. I think, and also there's a real borrowing capacity issue. I mean, even yesterday, it's coming up quite common, to be honest. A lot of first home buyers, we do the numbers on what they can borrow, where they want to buy, and it's 4.5 times income. And we just go, look, that's just nowhere near where you really need to be. 2 years ago when they could borrow 6.5, 7 times, they had enough borrowing capacity as a couple to get into a home they could live in long term. And I think a lot of first home buyers are literally, even if they do want to buy or build, they just can't get the lending required to make it happen. And so there's going to be a repricing event. If we stay in this situation where there's really tight borrowing capacity and builders can't build, and they want to keep releasing land, then they're going to have to either meet the market, or what they'll do is just keep land banking and just hold the supply off. And so that's great for our housing affordability crisis. And so we're also seeing, this is at the greenfield estates, developers aren't confident to do new house and land, apartments, because they think like it's a lot of risk right now. Like, do I want to take on that risk, or am I better just to hold my, my gunpowder and wait for when there's a real sentiment shift? And so I think a lot of developers are sitting on their hands, unless it's a really boutique, that they're going to be able to sell no matter what, right? It's maybe for the downsizers, right, who are cashed up. So I think if you were playing in that space, but they generally want, low to medium density in more affluent areas. So I think they're going to keep going, but the high density, high rise, I think that's killed that market. There's just not the demand from investors or first home buyers who drive those markets. The final bit is the mum and dad, doing the townhouse development in the middle ring. That's just, they can't get the borrowing capacity for it. They've already leveraged up. They're over leveraged. We're looking at our clients now who come to us to refinance, and probably 50% of people who come to us to refinance, they haven't got the servicing to refinance, even with some small changes in the last couple of weeks where we can do it on smaller assessment buffers. It's just people who've got too much debt and they can't refi. So I think a lot of those, mum and dad, investors looking to do those townhouses in the middle and ring suburbs, or a group of friends, they just can't do it and they don't want to take the risk. And the final thing in the construction element is the knockdown rebuilds in, more affluent areas. That market is absolutely killed. We've got 0 clients coming to us wanting to do builds. They are just haven't got the equity, haven't got the capacity, worried about building prices, worried about the economy, worried about their jobs. And they're just thinking, I just want to sit on my hands, see what happens. And so there's very few. I think the builders are really got work. They've signed up work 2 years in advance. But I think when they're starting to come off jobs in the next, 12, 18 months, I think they're really lacking in, new work down the pipeline. And so that's great if you're in that position, right? If you were thinking about maybe doing a build in a couple of years, I think you're going to be in a less demand supply issue where you were facing in 2021, where builders were just putting down massive prices on contracts if you wanted to sign up.
I think that's the key issue, is it's the lag here. I think that's really interesting, because we have clients on the property buying side of the equation who are looking at buying recently renovated or recently built homes, but nobody's interested in buying new. It's just, and certainly off the plan is, we don't do that anyway, really, but that's just gone out the window. There's no foreign buyers around. First home buyers have been smashed, as you mentioned. So looking further ahead, the pipeline's going to shrink. I think this there's still a decent amount of housing construction in the pipeline, a couple of 100,000 dwellings, but that's going to be shrinking over the next year, the next 18 months. The Housing Industry Association said multi-unit approvals are already down by 2/3 from the highs. And that's largely a Sydney and Melbourne story. I had Peter Tulip on the podcast this week, or just recording this week. So look out for that episode coming up in the next week or so. He made an interesting point. Peter Tulip, if you're not familiar, was formerly with the Reserve Bank in research, and he did a well-known paper on housing market modelling. And his view was that short-term changes in interest rates, like we've seen this week and last month, they do impact sentiment, but they don't have a big change, or don't make a big change to housing prices, which are more impacted by longer-term interest rates. Now, if you look at the 3-year bond yield in Australia, that's back up to around 3.6%. So relatively recently, it was back under 3. But now it's all the way back up to where it was. Well, if you rewind a year ago, as we speak today, it was 3.75. So we've gone down, we've come back up. But these little changes month to month aren't going to make a big difference to the housing market prices that we're seeing. But it might change sentiment in the short term. Now, it looks like the 3% lending assessment buffer is staying in place. So investors going forward are going to be stress tested at goodness knows what, 9% mortgage rate. So we've got a rental crisis coming, I think, for Sydney and Melbourne. Maybe not around regional Australia where there's still a lot of supply, but people are coming back into the big cities. Victoria's proposed a new land tax grab against property investors and landlords, which risks creating a bit of an inferno. I suppose the question is, how is this going to change, Chris? What's going to bring this to an end? Is it simply when interest rates finally roll over and start falling, or is there some other catalyst?
Yeah, I guess it all comes down to how sticky inflation is, right? And how high they've got to keep rates going, right? And I think the issue at the moment is that what the RBA rate increase will do to buyers. I do think it is over that 4%. I do think it's one of those mental hurdles. There's always these sort of, pressure tipping points, right? And I think that 4% number is what a lot of our clients were, really thinking that was going to be the limit, right? And a lot of the market was. But, I also think the 6% home loan rate is also where people, and currently a good rate's probably about 5.6%. So even if there was still one or two more rate increases, you still will be only getting to 6% home loan rate. So it's not at 6% yet. I think the market's also talking at rates at 6.5%. They're just not that. And even if you're an existing customer, just calling your bank, you'll get your rate down probably close to 5.6%. So I think there's definitely a sentiment shift, and buyers are definitely going to be less likely to want to purchase this month or last month versus say 2 or 3 months ago. So I do think there's going to be a pullback in some demand because people are going to want to see that clarity. But I also think there was a time where, in the last 2 or 3 months, sellers are saying, hang on a sec, there's low listings. Maybe I should actually sell right now. And I think a lot of real estate agents were, reading their commentary was, it's a much more stable market. It's much easier to transact right now than it was last year because you're more confident on a sale price. You're more confident you can find something. I think that's going to evaporate. I think, these last couple of rate increases are basically going to say to sellers, don't sell right now, wait for more certainty. And I think what we usually would see in spring, because we're already in winter now, a massive increase in supply. We didn't see it last year because of uncertainty. And I think this next 6 months is going to be really dire in terms of new listings. And so while we've got a demand decrease, we're also going to see a supply decrease. And if anyone's going to get really affected right now, there is a small cohort of the highly leveraged people who bought in 2020, 2021, etc. They're doing we've got lots of clients in this space. They're doing everything they can to, cut their spending, stay in their homes, selling other assets, etc., to stay in their home. You won't see a massive increase in debts, people rushing to sell because it's just the last thing they want to do. They'll do everything they can to hold on. But you might see that in sort of, where people haven't got any other options and where also the banks won't support you in greenfield estates. So I do think you're going to see a supply at the low end start to increase due to debt stress, and banks will probably support that rather than, in other areas they may really support the borrower. And I also think investors. So we absolutely have got lots of investors who come to us. One last week, things are tough, can't refinance, just impossible to refinance. So the conversation was, which property do they sell, right? Because if they sell one property, all their problems go away for a few years. And it's just a case of considering which one's less likely to bounce back really strongly, which one's less likely, to pay the biggest capital gains tax, which one's going to give them the biggest cash when restructuring. And so that's what investors do. They don't go and sell all their 7 properties or, at once. Not saying the investor who's got 7 properties knows what they're doing, to be honest. But they sell one, they'll give them a big cash bump, and then that gets them through this danger zone. Investors don't really have this game of getting all in or all out like they can do with shares. With property, it's much more slower and selective. So that's my take on what's happening right now in terms of rates. But ultimately, if you see this plateauing in rates, the higher rates and faster rates go up, the faster they'll fall. And so we could easily see in the other side, like in 2019, rates could be dropping at 0.5% or 1% in a month once things get under control. And so you got to almost see that as an opportunity if you're buying in a market where people are scared and there's low supply, and versus a market when rates are dropping. So yeah, that's what's happening.
Thanks. Hey, if you take nothing else away from this episode, point that Chris made there, call your bank. You'll get a better rate, either with the existing bank or lender that you're with, or just shop around. There's a lot of competition still for borrowers out there. So Scott Phillips at the Motley Fool would be proud of me for saying that. That's the point. He always hammers on the social media, but he's absolutely right. You can shop around and save yourself thousands. So definitely do that. I think, yes, at this time of year, normally you'd expect to see, I think SQM research anticipates a 15 to 20% decline in total listings. It's just, it's that time of year. The spring selling season isn't upon us just yet. Higher interest rates, yes, we'll probably see mortgage arrears rising. I saw S&P Global highlighted the postcodes with the highest mortgage arrears, places like the Blue Mountains, Katoomba, those kind of areas. So there's definitely some of that. But this is how monetary policy works, right? It takes cash out of the economy. People start cutting back on spending. I'm hearing people talk about that a lot. Just how can we cut back on expenditure? Well, we've got this going on. And as you said, though, when we do roll over, previous cycles have shown that the cuts come thick and fast when they do come. So definitely a question of hanging in there for a lot of people over the next 6 to 12 months, I suppose. So our third story and final story this week, Chris, building more homes where people want to live. Productivity New South Wales released an interesting paper on this. So New South Wales will require approximately 900,000 additional dwellings by 2041. I think if my mental arithmetic is right, that's 50,000 a year. Yeah, 50. It's hard to do when you're on the spot. 50,000 a year. I mean, that even could be unders given what's happening to population growth recently. But that's from the New South Wales Department of Planning and Environment. So the Commission is really trying to find ways to make housing more affordable. Their key findings or recommendations: raise average apartment heights in suburbs close to the CBD, close to job opportunities, transport hubs which leverage infrastructure capacity. These are all points that Peter Tulip was actually making himself. He's big on the supply side. Not so many people want to talk about a reduction in the immigration level, but that could become a political issue over the coming years. But any interesting takeaways from that report for you, Chris?
Look, I guess just a state government report. It's a productivity sort of inquiry, et cetera, into the housing market. I think this is, there's been lots of other inquiries. The Falinsky report was a big one last year, and they seem to be coming thick and fast. I guess what's my take on this is that there's a real movement from, changing the way that our city's built and building more. Even the title of this, building more homes where people want to live, right? It's that terminology. And I think what happens is Sydney's going to have to, this is basically in Sydney we're talking, I think Sydney's going to have a story change. It's going to be, hey, we're going to change the way that our city's built. And over the next 10, 20 years, this is how we're going to build, house more people, right? And I think that story is going to start to feed into zoning changes, and then that's going to create opportunities for developers, et cetera. Whereas before it was like high density in little pockets, right? Around the airport, Epping, St. Leonard's and Greenfield estates. And the NIMBYs really won. They still controlled the votes. But I think the state government's going to flip that and say, hang on a sec, we need to share this load across our whole city. And I think zoning changes are going to start to happen. So how does this affect you as an owner? Well, if you're in a suburb that has had typically a lot of NIMBY protection, right? I think you've got to be a little bit cognizant that that may change, right? So you might find that the houses around the main roads and certain pockets in that suburb don't just rely that you've got through the last 20 years, you're going to get through the next 20 years. I think you're going to have to start to see that there's going to be more high rise, medium density start to get approved. And, that can change the suburb dynamic and be actually, density can be great for lifestyle, right? It can be great for cafes and things like that. But it can also be, if you're backing onto an apartment of 5 stories that used to be a house, it's not going to be great for the lifestyle of that person in the house. And so I think you should be extra careful right now when you're investing in going, okay, well, what part of the suburb are they more likely to rezone and what part are they not likely to rezone? And this is even more incentive to get into the heritage streets and away from the train station a bit further, and be really much more selective. But that's my take on the story. I think the Yimbys are really starting to get a bit of steam. And we spoke to Committee of Sydney CEO yesterday on another podcast. And I think that's the big takeaway, that the density is probably going to shift. And if I believe, though, if similar to Peter Chilk, we had him on the other podcast a couple of times as well, that if you do change zoning in areas where the feasibility, like the Northern Beaches and the eastern suburbs and lower North Shore of Sydney, and you make it now, hang on a sec, we could have built 2 levels, but now we can build 5 levels. Now we can build 30 apartments rather than 6 apartments. That then changes the dynamic, right? And if they can sell those 30 apartments, they'll build them. And I think in these areas, there's enough demand for the builders to build this stuff. And I think they're going to have more capacity given that there's a big demand in slowdown. So, I think this is a story that's going to keep on brewing. And it's going to be a big election issue over the next 4 years as well. Because housing affordability is just becoming a real problem, and rental affordability.
I think zoning, you're hearing it more and more. There's going to be definitely more encouragement to fill that missing middle. So more townhouses, more medium density development. New South Wales, historically, certainly over the past 3 decades, only building 6 dwellings per 1,000 residents on average, as compared to 8 for Victoria and 9 for Queensland. Built a lot of apartments in Queensland over the last decade or 15 years or so. So there's definitely going to be a push in this direction. I think look, there's a lot of people out there say, well, basically change zoning and that changes everything. I'm not personally so convinced. I remember maybe a dozen years ago, and I used to write for a couple of property magazines and online sites. And so a lot of people were saying at the time that the planning system's broken. It's all about not enough approvals can get through. It's all too slow. And then interest rates fell, and then construction went absolutely ballistic. All over Sydney, apartments going up, Parramatta, Blacktown, Lower North Shore, North Sydney. Melbourne was the same, CBD, Docklands, and Brisbane we'd never seen anything like it in Brisbane before. 2016, there was, I remember an article, Roger Montgomery, saying the apartment oversupply was 18 months of overhang. It was worse than Ireland. It was worse than the US in 2007. So we can go very quickly from the narrative changing to, well, in the space of 5 years, from approvals being all of the problem, the zoning's too tight, the zoning restrictions are causing expensive housing, to within 5 years, we were talking about way too much housing. We've overbuilt. It's going to be a systemic risk. So I think a lot of this stuff is maybe cyclical. And at the moment, we're just seeing supply tighter and tighter. We've got record high immigration at a time when builders are going bust. There's capacity issues in the industry, can't get access to trades and materials. But I wouldn't be surprised if in, say, 5 years' time, we're starting to see more buildings coming out of the ground, and then potentially people talking about oversupply again. There is definitely a cyclical issue here. It's not all about just change the zoning and everything shifts.
I think you're right. I think even if there was a zoning change, people would still have borrowing capacity problems. They'll still have sentiment issues around where the market is. They'll still have worries about builders, etc. So I think you're right. But I do think it is an element in terms of creating more ways for developers to get build to sell to market, right, and support our construction. Because at the moment, a lot of people aren't wanting to go near the high density. There's a real sort of that's not what people want from families. It's not the locations. It's not where people typically their choice is, but they can't afford houses. And so if there's this in the ground, in this middle ground, there's this option where it's a bigger apartment, which just don't exist. There's just not enough 3-bed apartments in Sydney, for example, or there's more likely to be better townhouse developments in sort of these affluent areas. I do think that first home buyers and upgraders will have to look at these because they can't afford their first option. So there's a real gap there in the market. And I think even for downsizers, they want to downsize, but there's very lack of, you look at a development Double Bay, that will sell out pretty quick, right? Because there's just a real demand for that product and there's just a lack of it. So I think that's what we would see if there was this zoning change.
Isn't there a bit of a thing here though, Chris, with developers as price makers versus price takers? In other words, why would developers be incentivized to flood the market, reduce prices, and therefore reduce the price of their own product? It seems a bit counterintuitive to say, well, if we just change the zoning, then we'll get an overbuild and prices will fall and developers will be happy to build for less. I don't know, it just feels a bit too simplistic to me. And if you're looking for evidence, well, every month we get these figures on building approvals. Then we see the number of dwellings that are approved but not commenced. They're just sitting there in purgatory. I mean, that doesn't really sort of fit the narrative of if we just change the zoning, everything is fixed. I think it's more nuanced anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're right. I think I do think the feasibility in these suburbs does change, right? So, what you can build, if that changes, then the profitability of that project changes, right? You can see it around the eastern suburbs, right? Like you think it's Fortis. Look how many buildings they're doing, right? Like anything that's a great opportunity because they know they can sell it. We drove through Double Bay the other week and, bang, new development. So, they do want to build if the feasibility is there, right? So I think it just creates, more options for them. Whereas typically they'd have to go to areas where it's very easy to get projects through.
We did see that in Brisbane, the 2014 city plan, and suddenly there were townhouses going in all over the place, which couldn't previously have been built under some of the previous zonings. A lot of medium density, a lot of townhouses went in of various qualities. It does make an impact. But then fast forward to 6 or 7 years down the track, and now we've got shortages again. So it does sort of go round in a cycle a little bit. Is there any implications here for people in the market today or prospective investors or home buyers?
Look, I think that ultimately, we're going to have a building issue regardless, right? So I think you're not going to have this big oversupply of apartments hitting the market where you've got to be worried about, there's all these buildings are going to hit the market by the time you, settle in your property, etc. So that big real issue where people are bought off the plan and, all of a sudden, 3 years later, there's all these other off the plans around them. I just don't think that really exists, and there's not real massive vacancy rates. And so I think that protects people who've got maybe high density at the moment. Potentially there should be bigger falls or lower growth, but they're getting protected right now because there's not building happening, right?
There's definitely this part of the market as well that is really built for investors. So previously it was non-resident or foreign buyers buying it. I think that's really stopped because of the surcharges in place for foreign buyers. But I think that's where build to rent will step up. I think the build to rent to some extent will replace what used to be built. Some of those sort of smaller apartments that were really built for the purpose of being rented out. But that market marches to its own drum to some extent, and most home buyers are active in a different segment. Bit going on, but certainly in the short term anyway, supply is just getting tighter and tighter, and that's not going to be helped over the next few months, given the time of year that we're at, and probably see listings fall. It'd be an interesting thing, but I just can't see prices falling that much. There's a lot of hoo-ha about Reserve Bank hiking, but I don't know, unless they hike significantly further. The supply is just so tight at the moment, it's just hard to see prices moving much. But it's like they always say on the social media, remind me of this in 3 months and we'll see where I went wrong.
Yeah, the interesting about higher rates is that people become pickier, right? Because you're saying, well, if I've got to pay this bigger mortgage, do I really want to take that mortgage on to buy this property? When rates are really low, people are less picky because they say, well, it's better than renting. I need to get in the markets, prices are rising, etc. So people become, they start buying the B, the C, the D grade properties, right? What's been interesting in the last 6 months is especially over the $1 million, there's been very little stock. And I think you're just comparing, a lot of clients are sending us properties. They can't find anything. When they do send us properties, they're just two lemons. And it's like trying to pick out the best out of the two lemons. Well, they're both lemons, keep looking, right? And unfortunately, that's been the reality when we're looking at clients and what they're buying is they're out in the market, they're looking at things and they're just trying to find something that's, okay. It's a B or a C grade. They're just very hard to find the great properties. And so I'd say right now, buyers are just, if though you've got those properties right now, you've been in the last 6 months, I think you've been had a bit of an opportunity because there has been a little bit of desperation FOMO. You can see that in clearance rates. I reckon, though, that buyers will become more picky now that there's been a couple more rate increases. And so if you have got one of those properties, you're less likely to sell them. But also, I think sellers on good properties are just going to sit out. And so I think that you're going to see this real tightening of great properties on the market. So the quality is going to really dry up even further. And buyers are less, that buying that auction clearance rate may start to drop again because you might see people are like, you know what, I don't really want to buy that. I'm not worried about prices running on me as much. And so the B, Cs and Ds, which have probably been able to get away with an okay price in the last 6 months, I think that's going to start to lag. The other thing with medians as well is that, even though the median price has fallen 10%, well, the quality of property on the market's fallen by at least more than 10%, right? So median prices are falling because more people are selling the cheaper properties rather than selling the more expensive properties. And so there's been a segmentation shift, not just pricing shift in the market, which is always forgotten about because when you look at medians, you don't know that there's actually the percentage of people selling, under the 50% median versus people selling above the 50% median shifts, and more people are selling at the bottom end, which shifts the median down further. So, lots happening, Pete, and look forward to this chat next week because I'm sure there'll be 3 big stories to cover.
Yeah, I think always a key takeaway point. Real estate is a slow-moving asset class, so you should really try. If you're an investor or home buyer, you should try and invest for how you think the world's going to be in 24 months' time. There's so much with social media. The rah-rah, Reserve banks changed interest rates. The hysteria almost around every interest rate decision and. I think you just mentioned clearance rates. Well, Sydney was 80% last week.
Yeah.
So to think when people are getting a bit overexcited about little tweaks in monetary policy, 80% is full on boom time levels. So yes, of course they'll fall from there because that's unsustainably high, but it's not exactly the end of the world territory just yet. So thank you so much everyone for tuning in. As always, do send us your property questions via the link in the show notes, or if you just want to say good day, you can catch me at Pete Wargent Blogspot. That's my daily blog, or at Pete Wargent on Twitter if you must. And you definitely subscribe for the Rask podcast on your favorite podcast player, of course. And I think actually this might go up on YouTube as well. So Chris, if people want to get hold of you at Blusk, where's the best place to go?
Just jump on the show notes. We've had, lots of clients come to us in the last few weeks off the podcast. If you're one of those, thanks so much. But yeah, fill in the form and we'll get in contact and start to figure out the numbers. And even if you just want to understand the numbers, I think that's what a lot of people have coming to us for in the last few weeks is just, what can I do? What's my options? Because there's that real uncertainty right now of how lending affects your situation. And just getting that clarity. I think it's, even if you think about buying in 6, 12 months time, I think it's just nice to know, what can I do today? What can I do to improve my situation? So, don't feel like you've got to be ready to go and you just want to push the button. Sometimes just getting that clarity, we'd love to give you that.
Sounds like you need some rest, Chris. We don't want you coming down with pneumonia for next week. So you take it easy for a few days. As they say on all podcasts these days, click like, subscribe, leave us a review, and definitely send us your questions. So take it easy, Chris. Look forward to seeing you next episode.
Look forward to you next week. Hopefully these antibiotics kick in. Cheers, Pete. Thanks.
Cheers.